Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final day of Virtually 2022, Nomensa's free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference. Today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, a day that's very close to our hearts here at Nomensa. We believe the web is for everyone, and that's why accessible practices are baked into everything we do. We really hope the sessions we've hosted here at Virtually you found valuable and have helped you in your accessibility journey. First up, I'd like to say a big thanks to all our virtually speakers so far. They've been excellent. We have 3 more sessions for you today. A panel discussion on what it means to be an accessible organisation at 3 p.m. UK time, hosted by our Director of Accessibility, Alistair Campbell, and with panellists Beverly Newing from Ministry of Justice, Pavel Pomerantsev of Squarespace, Zveta Dinova of ASOS, and Sajinder Jabanda-Wilson of Virgin Media. And then also at 1 p.m. UK time, we have Max Fumagalli and Marco Fabri of Depop discussing their accessibility journey. First up, though, we have Principal Accessibility Consultant here at Nomensa, Ronny Hendriks, with his talk, Forms Over Function. Ronny's going to take a look at what makes a good and accessible form and show that it can still be beautiful in design. We'll look at what things to consider from the early planning stages to design and into the technical nitty-gritty of it all. So you'll be making a form that everyone can use while reaching your goals. This session is, of course, recorded and will be available online shortly after the conference. Please do get involved in the discussion in the chat and make sure chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and ensure that everyone can see your messages. And please do also submit your questions for Ronny using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. So yeah, over to you, Ronny, to kick things off.
All right, hi all. Thank you very much for being here. It's really nice to have so many of you here. As Henry said, today is the 3rd Thursday of May, which means it's Global Accessibility Awareness Day 2022. It's the 11th run already. And yeah, what better way what better day than this to share some accessibility thoughts. You'll find them pretty much everywhere online. You will interact with more of them on any given day that you might be aware of. And whenever a site requires information from a user, they come into play. I am, of course, talking about one of the internet staples, forms. But before we go on, let me give you a brief introduction. My name is Ronny Hendriks. I am a principal accessibility consultant here at Nomensa. I bring a 20-year background in web development, focused mainly on accessibility, with a fun combination of a social work study thrown in there, where some life events really sparked that interest of accessibility for me. Based in the Netherlands, I've worked with multiple Dutch governmental bodies and commercial clients, helping and training them to create more inclusive and accessible online interactions, and making their services available to everyone in an equal manner. At Nomensa, I'm helping our clients gain grip on their often vast digital estates, and I support their efforts of equality and inclusion by increasing their accessibility. My main focus areas are on strategic accessibility change with pragmatic approaches and technical training and support. But that's enough about me. Let's get back to forms. So you might, after all these months, have some travel coming up and need to renew your identification papers before you can enjoy that holiday. These days, those are pretty common for a service like that to be or start online. So you're providing all of your required information up front from your comfy couch using an online form. After you submitted that form, your products will be delivered at your doorstep, or you can arrange for pickup shortly after in town hall. All of the forms online serve various purposes. First off, they make it easier for you as a user. So you're not confined to a specific day or time to go to City Hall, potentially even multiple times to get those papers, but you can start the process whenever it suits you. Could be even middle in the night. And then often pick up and arrange that pickup time as well, all in a manner that suits you. You're not required to call a customer service if they have a form available. So you're not required to wait for a lengthy amount of time in a waiting queue, or to speak to someone which you don't even know, and you might be uncomfortable with like talking to strangers. Instead, if you're buying something online, for example, you can just send out your question using a form and await their response, move on with the next thing on your to-do list. On the other side of the form, there are also benefits to be had for the receivers. Like indirect ways of communication, like questions, are often far more manageable time-wise. If they come in, requests can be better targeted to specific people in your organization that have more in-depth knowledge, which results in quicker and better responses and a happier customer. Forms might also help spread out the load on those waiting queues of other communication channels, like your call center. The slide on shows a tree with one of its thick branches leaning almost vertically to the right. It's about 3 feet off the ground, and it's supported by a carved wooden hand-shaped pillar. Forms are a similar pillar for the web, much like we have email and social media. They are pervasive, and they are key components most of us use every single day. Forms come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. There are the forms that we use for online shopping. They will often have various forms in the process to fill in your payment detail, delivery details, but also your shopping basket itself is a form that has a persistent state. You can save an item in there and often come back to it even days or weeks later, and it might still be there if the product's available. There's also forms to book that once of a lifetime holiday to Malibu, for example. You might need to be quicker on that one. There might be some timing involved because someone else might take that beautiful house you're eyeing up. And they often have more complex interactions, like date pickers for you to fill in. And then there's the visually simple one, Google, the one that's probably the most used across the internet. It's used by millions upon millions of people daily. It has a single input field that accepts all kinds of different inputs and queries you can put into it. And using that single input, it unlocks the whole web for you. A bit of meme time. Here we have Woody and Buzz Lightyear from Toy Story. Buzz gestures to Woody with his arms wide apart, and the caption reads, "Inaccessible forms, inaccessible forms everywhere." Nowadays, especially since the whole recent pandemic situation, online interactions have become more and more important. People stuck at their homes still need to get things done. They want products delivered and have taxes to be filed. And all of these require them to fill in often quite lengthy forms. Unfortunately, inaccessible forms are everywhere. They are an enormous problem for people to participate online. And making forms for everyone, however, is a big challenge because many variables come into play. Our work at Nomensa shows that forms are generally a hotspot for accessibility problems. All too often, we come across forms that are too complicated or contain unnecessary questions, lack basic accessibility features like labels and proper contrast, and they are often near impossible to use with assistive technologies. So, yearly research by WebAIM among screen reader users also confirms these findings. It shows that like complex and difficult to operate forms are a big problem to assistive technology users. Combined with some legislation for governmental services, the process of making forms and websites as a whole accessible has luckily seen a big boost over the years. And that's part of why we today will have a look at some of these related challenges. So there's numerous technical possibilities to improve the accessibility of forms, starting with the use of correct code and writing valid HTML, adding proper labels and attaching Aria attributes, all of which will help your users whenever they rely on assistive technology or not, but using and understanding the forms you've created. But first, however, let's focus on design. On the slide, we see a dictionary explaining the meaning of the word design. It says, a plan or drawing produced to show the look and the function or working of an, in this case, form before it is made. Design plays a big role, both from a visual and from a functional point of view. I don't really like the term, but you might have heard it as being called shifting left, moving to earlier in the creation process, moving those important steps to earlier in that creative process. It's about like thinking about accessibility barriers and how to solve them, even before writing that first line of code. To put effort and thought into your design to produce good forms, because that will translate into a good user experience. We at Nomensa strongly believe that a lot of those accessibility problems can be solved really early on in that creation process. It's about thinking through important steps, like accessibility, first. And it will make you not only focus on that accessibility compliance, but it will help you to go steps and steps beyond that in making sure that your upcoming form is usable for everyone. Using solid design principles from interaction design, which is about making your form easier to use, from content design, which is about making your form better to understand, and from service design, which is about creating a smooth process to complete their user journey, you can lay a great foundation before that code is even written. One of the first things to do is to look at the actual information you need to be able to help your user. There isn't much more that irritates people than doing stuff that they feel is unnecessary. So one of your key starting points is drilling down on that information, reducing those questions to the bare minimum. And this is especially important for longer and more complex forms, but it's still a good key principle to keep in mind nonetheless. Have a collaborative session like depicted on the slide here. We see a group of people around a table, and one of the people, a woman, is standing next to the wall, and the wall is covered in all kinds of colored post-its. We see pink post-its, yellow post-its, orange post-its, all grouped together. They are clearly mapping out information. A session with other people that are involved in the overall process to get everyone's input on what kind of information they need, and more importantly, what kind of information they can do without. It's a good way of going about this is what we call a question protocol, which is basically a short process that serves as a reminder for people in your organization that are creating forms to think about each question they are asking using a form. It should ask them to substantiate why they need the information they are requesting and what they will use it for. So then you can think of questions like, do I really need to ask this question? In what way does it help me to complete the user journey? Or do we already have this information from a previous interaction? Depending on the purpose of your form, there can be, of course, other questions around how you will validate the information you receive. So think hard about your questions. On the slide, we have two hands holding a block of Post-it notes and a Sharpie. There are some crumpled notes up in the top right corner. Writing good questions is hard. Not only to get the correct information, for example, during a survey you're running, but also because of the way you write your questions can really impact the end user. When confronted with questions someone must answer, especially open-ended questions, they can feel overwhelmed or confronted. People might experience a sense of anxiety. Are they answering the question correctly? The question might trigger a flurry of thoughts, so much that someone might be overwhelmed and not know where to begin in even formulating their answer. So, of course, the way you write your questions makes a big difference. A good question allows the user to more easily provide you with that correct information. It will help them understand why they need to provide it. So instead of using one big open-ended question with a big text area underneath for your answer, try and break it down, make it more granular, splitting it into multiple smaller, maybe even more closed questions that are generally easier for people to answer and complete. Be aware, however, that on closed questions, your predefined answers might not match their expectation. So the option might not be relevant to them, or they might not know the answer at this time. So make sure you always provide a relevant way around those situations. For example, by providing them with an I don't know option, or the possibility for someone to still have an other option with a manual input field. Once you have all of your questions, you want to keep that collaboration going, because it's time to start building that form, laying it all out. So no, not digitally, don't start coding yet. Start with some good old-fashioned paper or a whiteboard and just start sketching out together how your form should flow, how it should work. Doing this in a non-digital way helps you to often iterate quickly and let everyone that's at that table or in that room or in your collaborative like Zoom meeting to work in parallel. And then you can review and combine ideas. So it's really an effective way of coming to a good construction for your form. You'll also notice how I didn't talk about how it looks. Looks can come much later in the process. So this phase is all about designing and organizing your form in a logical and in an efficient manner, making sure that the questions are asked in an order that makes sense to the user, that it's logical. You can decide then during this process also if you want to split up the form, for example, across multiple pages to make that separation between segments even more prevalent. And then there's everything from having a single question per page, like gov.uk does its services, to having everything on one page and potentially overwhelming a user, and everything in between, of course. We are a huge fans of collaboration. not only with our clients, but also internally. We find it super useful, like as the slide says, to just lay it all out on the table and talk it through with the team. You'll get so much more insight when different people all bring their views to the table. And that's all stuff that can feed into your design processes and into your forms. So think Lego. Building further upon that design foundation, let's start to pull in some of those technical bits as well. The building blocks, so to say, as the blue Lego depicts on the slide. I'm talking about the various input fields. The input fields are like the core pieces of your form. It's what's putting those together is what's getting you the information you're looking for. We're combining this with the previous layout phase. So we're still not writing any code at this point. We are basically taking our design layouts and annotating those sketches with the types of input fields that you intend to use. So you can talk them through. You can talk through how they should operate, what the options should be, what the user flow is, how the user journey looks going from field to field. That annotation is important because having a sketch of the final form does not mean that you end up with an accessible or a properly usable form. It might still be usable, similar to like the Lego house that's depicted on the left-hand side of the slide. It's a mix of all kinds of different Lego bricks, different shapes, sizes, colors. It looks like a house, but it doesn't feel like a thought out and coherent piece yet. On the right-hand side, we see a row of houses that have thought put into them. They are built out of pieces that accentuate the different styles of each house, the brick patterns, the arcs on the windows. And all of the combinations just make it feel like it looks together, even though it's still for a row of 4 different styles of houses. Together, they form a nice and coherent street. So don't just slap everything together. Iterate over your steps in your designs and put that combined thought into what you're making. That way, you can combine your questions and the required building blocks into a nice, coherent form. Let's talk Semantic HTML and dive a bit into the coding part of forms. We won't go into super complex code examples, but I do want to pass that foundational knowledge onto you. Using default HTML elements, or what we call Semantic HTML, it gives you a lot of free accessibility support. And they are well supported across assistive technology. All this means is that when you use them, they can be operated in various different ways. They can be operated by a mouse, using touch, but also for people only using a keyboard. Using those default HTML elements will also provide all kinds of relevant information to the user about what they're working with. Things like the type of components. Is it a set of checkboxes and what are their names? The answers that they can choose. The information and the keyboard usability ensure that people that use assistive technology, for example, a screen reader, or that use operating devices like a switch controller or a headwand, can all use your form properly. Quite often we find custom implementations of form input fields on websites. And there are mostly two reasons to encounter these. So either they are developers are using a framework that's providing these often inaccessible components, and they are just reusing what's already there, or there might be a need for more extensive custom styling that some form elements currently lack some support of, or they need added functionality like auto completion of searchable terms, for example. But therein lies the danger of those custom implementations, is that they don't have all of that default accessibility features built in from the start. So they are a very common cause of issues. You can definitely manually add those using Aria attributes and JavaScript. So we'll have a very quick look at that, because yeah, you might be thinking, what is Aria? It goes a bit beyond the scope of this talk to dive really deep into that, but let me give you a quick summary. Aria stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it's a W3C web standard that provides additional attributes that you can use to identify features and states on HTML elements. So it provides you with a way to add that additional information for assistive technology on your custom components. For comparison, I've used an image here of a spoon with grains of salt on it. As to me, that represents the purpose that Aria serves. It's meant to flavor your code, so to speak. And while it's super effective at doing so, like salt, it should also be used sparingly. It's for a reason that the first rule of Aria is to not actually use Aria, and still try and use that semantic HTML first, and only add Aria when you absolutely have to. Aria, so Aria comes into play when you need to add those accessibility features into your custom code. And in essence, it provides two core components to do so. There is the role attribute, which basically allows you to tell what type of an element someone is dealing with. So for example, it allows you to identify your custom implemented checkbox as actually being a checkbox. And then there are the Aria attributes. These all begin with Aria dash and then followed by a term. And these allow you to add things like a name, a state, or various properties like relationships to other components. So for example, you have Aria label, which gives you the option to give a name to an element. And there's Aria checked for your custom checkbox to define a state of either true or false for communication. But be careful though. On the slide, we see a piece of music, several music sheets, and we also see a beautiful violin. Aria is similar in, or trying to make the comparison of Aria as a technique to Aria as its musical equivalent. It's something you can't just give someone some pieces of paper and a violin and expect them to play that music on the first day. It will probably sound really bad. So yeah, it's a process that needs careful and deliberate practice. Coming back to that first rule of Aria a bit, and about not using it unless you need to, that's not for nothing. Pages that use Aria tend to have a lot more accessibility problems than pages that rely on native HTML. One of the reasons is that Aria only provides a user with the information you tell it to send. So you have to, it's your responsibility to use JavaScript to make sure that the information you are communicating is correct. And that, for example, again, the checkbox state is actually matching what a user is doing. So there's a bit of an interaction that you need to take care of. So use it sparingly and always test it very, very well. Preferably with the use of a screen reader, for example, like VoiceOver or NVDA, and see if the information is relayed correctly. It's all about practice and rehearsal. So yeah, you could do this and you can definitely learn this, but it does take a little bit of time and effort. Let's talk about input labels. The slide shows some "hello, my name is" stickers with like 4 Sharpies next to it. You might recognize these stickers from conventions you've attended in the past. They're super useful because you can have your name on a sticker and other people will know how to approach you. You don't spend the whole day answering the same question on what your name is. I wanted to touch upon a similar problem we often encounter when examining forms during audits. So one of the most common issues to find is input fields not being labeled properly. Again, this corresponds with research from WebAIM. They have a report called the WebAIM Million, which got recently updated for this year. It's a yearly report where they test 1 million of the web's most popular homepages. And it turns out that 39% of the input fields that they tested against turned out to be missing a label. Over the years, this has improved quite a bit, luckily. Again, because of legislation, a lot of websites have been updated. So it's down from almost 60% a couple of years ago, but it's still 40% of all of the input fields on the web, like generally not having or not being identifiable, is a huge problem for people to deal with. And that's why providing that name to an input field using a label is super important. Adding this name can be done in several ways. The first, and looking back at the semantic HTML part, preferred way to add a label to an input field is using a native HTML solution of using the actual label element. Connecting it together using the for attribute to point to the ID value of an input field creates a robust connection between the two. One of the more common errors to watch out for in this regard is something we encounter quite frequently, actually, is people, instead of using the ID value in the for attribute, people will use the name value of the input field, which unfortunately does not work. Another way of naming fields could be using Aria. So for naming elements, Aria has several attributes available, and you might think, oh, that's pretty straightforward, and go back to the Aria label I just mentioned and put in some actual text, and I'm done. Unfortunately, that is not what happens. So what happens is, much like the first example on the slide, we just see an empty input field. We see a box with an outline. There's no name attached to it, no visual name attached to it. While the input name or the input field does have a label, that label is not visible. So in this case, for a screen reader user, they might have the information they need, but now someone that's relying on their vision does not know what the field means. Alternatively, you could use Aria labeled by combined with like a similar ID value parent construction to connect it to another element, say like a preceding heading in the second example. So we see lorem ipsum as a heading text and then an input field underneath, and the two are connected using Aria labeled by, referencing the ID value of the heading. Do keep in mind, like again, with this technique, there are definitely some downsides. One of them is so normally using a label element on an input field, if you would click on the text of the label, it would automatically focus on move the keyboard focus on the input field, so you can start typing. That does not happen when using Aria labeled by, which then quickly reduces the amount of clickable area to activate it, and that might cause problems on smaller screens or like mobile devices or people that have difficulty using motor control, using touch, for example, or a mouse. So placeholder text as a label then. That's you might be asking yourself, like, should I do so? You come across those very often. Placeholder text being used as a label, and people think it looks really nice and clean, but the short answer would be no, please just don't. Yes, it will work somewhat in giving a label to your input field on a technical level, but this has various problems. Foremost, as the name placeholder implies, it's not meant to be used as a label, but as content that's pretty much non-essential and meant to be replaced with something else. The examples on the slide show this problem. So the first example shows an input field where a placeholder text is being used as a label for a date field. It's requesting my date of birth and it's mentioning a format. Unfortunately, in this case, I was having trouble reading the form. I zoomed in with my browser. The input field didn't scale correctly, but the placeholder text did, and now the text is too large for me to read the full required formatting. So I'm not aware, should I put in a 2-digit day with a slash, a 2-digit month with a slash, and then a 2 or a 4-digit year number? I then started typing, but still forgot about the formatting. Currently now the label unfortunately has gone because it's a placeholder. It got replaced with my actual text, and I can't see or can't reference any previous formatting anymore. So I would have to remove all of my already inputted numbers to be able to reference back to that formatting. So yeah, it's just a bad user experience to have placeholders as a label. A quick note on grouping questions. So another important aspect to consider when creating a form is to provide that clear buildup of your information. The way you structure your forms can help people fill them in more easily. So during the design phase, you've probably identified sets of fields that belong together. And in the layout, you've grouped these fields together visually. So now we need to make sure that we use the correct code to communicate that same information to assistive technology. This can be done using the field set markup, and then a relationship of the grouping will be created. So field sets are a way in HTML to tell a user that certain input fields belong together. In the code example, we can see a field set as a container around several input groups. The field set contains a legend element that has the details on the grouping in there. For example, the field set group collects your postal address. You would combine the first and last name, the street, the postal code, and the city into one group and label that your address. So if someone using a screen reader now enters the first field, they will hear that they are inside of a group, that they are on the field first name, and that the group belongs to the group your address. So they have all of the relevant information as soon as they focus the field, and they get more context. So the default styling clearly indicates how a field set works. It creates a bordered outline, and the legend will be displayed on top of the group. This can, of course, be changed again with CSS to suit your needs. So helping people along, combining clear questions with good supportive text will help reduce potential fear of answering those questions wrong. Your initial collaborative sessions might have drawn the conclusion that you need to provide some additional text on a question. If you do so, then don't forget to make that a code connection as well, because the way screen reader users navigate through a form, they will go from field to field, and they might miss non-connected text that is in between your form fields. You can also use this to add more detail on a question, like explaining difficult words or provide instructions on a format you require the answer to be in. And adding this information will help prevent users from entering information incorrectly, and then them having to wait to be confronted by an error message as soon as you try and validate it and it turns out to be wrong. So one way we often encounter this additional information is by the use of tooltips, which are little icons commonly with a question mark inside of them, located in a form field or next to a question. Hovering over them will often reveal a nice little pop-up with some clarification. Unfortunately, that's mostly the only interaction that you're getting from them. They're quite often not accessible or can't be operated with a keyboard. Hovering over them might also be problematic for people with fine motor controls or people using a touch device. It might only reveal when a touch event is happening, and then a finger might be in the way. People might have trouble actually keeping their finger on top of a small element. And screen reader users might also not know that there is information to be had, because the tooltips won't receive that keyboard focus, or they're not named properly. The interaction isn't relayed, stuff like that. I would personally always recommend just having that additional information visible. Like in the example on the slide here, we see a feedback form with a question. There is a short description of what the intent of the question is and why they are asking it. You can create a more user-friendly experience this way. If you then have this helper text, you can combine the text with the input field using Aria described by. This way, the helper text will be announced as soon as a screen reader user focuses on the field. They will hear the question, they will hear that they are in a text area that requires their input, and then they will hear the supportive text afterwards. So they are being provided with all of the relevant and required information all at once. Then a short note on having fields required or not. Earlier, I mentioned that during the design phase of your form, you should have a good think about what kind of questions you'll be asking. And basically, you should try and keep the number of questions to a minimum and remove any questions that you don't really need the answers to. Following this process, you should mostly end up with a form where each of the questions is a required question. And this becomes something that you can then easily state to a user upfront, and there's no need to specify each field as being required afterwards. Sometimes, though, you will still end up with a form that is a mix of required and optional fields. And then there are various ways you can identify those, both visually and in code. Looking at the visual identification, though, we often see fields marked as required by having an asterisk at the end of the question. For more internet-savvy people, this might be a very common visual indication that a field is required, but that does not help everyone. There are plenty of people out there that aren't familiar with this pattern, with this association. And therefore, it's very important to inform people upfront about the meaning of the asterisk, like shown in the example. It says asterisk indicates a required field, and then the next field has name with an asterisk behind it. Another problem with just making this visible using an asterisk is that when a screen reader user gets focus on this field, they will hear first name asterisk instead of an actual indication that the field is required. An option would then be to use HTML validation with the required attribute, or add it using Aria by adding the Aria required equals true attribute. Both will cause a screen reader to hear, like get additional audio feedback on a field being required. Be wary though that having the required attribute, the HTML attribute on there will actually prevent the form from being submitted, while going the Aria required route means you will have to manually validate against if a required field is filled in or not. Also keep in mind that the asterisk that is in the label will then still be announced. So you will have to hide that for a screen reader to prevent further confusion. An easier way would, of course, be to state the required state as plain text in the label. This is a lot easier to implement. It's very clear for every user. But going back to the first point, it's not really aesthetically pleasing and can look quite busy if you have multiple required fields. So yeah, instead, you should turn this around, circle back to picking your questions carefully. And then I hope you'll notice that you can save yourself a lot of effort on this implementation by only asking those important questions. Should you then still end up with an optional field, you can have all of your fields, or you can only have to mark that field as being optional. if all the others are required. So you can basically turn it around. This way you will still end up with a cleaner looking form without all the asterisks or longer labels, while still giving your users a great experience when using required fields. That's almost it. So there's so much more to be said on forms, but unfortunately we have to wrap up for today. So let's summarize quickly. We found that forms are key components of the web. We've established that, shown by research by WebAIM, for example, inaccessible forms are everywhere and are a main problem. We've also established that it's smart to keep things simple and think about your questions. Design here is key to getting a good user experience. That's best done to collaborate and to iterate, and you should build with meaning. Using Semantic HTML and season it with Aria where needed. I'm leaving you with something I mentioned earlier on in the talk. So put effort and thought into your design to produce good forms, because good form design translates to a good form experience. Don't start building a form using your or don't just start building a form using your CMS tool or start coding fields together and hope for the best. Take the extra time up front to build, or I should say design, a better foundation. It will save you, and far more importantly, your users, a whole lot of trouble.
Thanks, Ronny. Yeah, well, great talk. So much useful and practical information in there. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, please do submit them. I can see a couple trickling in now. Ronny, you mentioned kind of testing with screen readers, like really, really important. Kind of for those that maybe aren't as experienced in accessibility, but are looking to bake more accessible processes into what they're doing, how would you recommend they would test their existing forms? Have you got a process you could share, or any tips?
So key step would, for me, is always to start with how well does it operate using a keyboard. Because yes, you could jump straight into trying out a screen reader, but they are fairly complex in the way they operate and then have their own interactions. But in the end, all of the interactions that happen for a screen reader or for other assistive technologies always translates back to how well does it work with a keyboard. That's the translation that's being made if you're using a screen reader, but also if you're using other forms of input devices, like a switch or a clicker. They all translate back into keyboard interactions at the very core of the process. So start by tabbing through. So you can use tab and shift tab to move focus across the field. Try and see if you can see where the focus is. Try and see if you can select an answer from a drop-down. All of that should pretty much work out of the box as long as you, again, use those default HTML elements. So especially if you're using your own implementations, have features like an autocomplete where you have, for example, a search field and you enter a search and it comes up with several options. Make sure that you can reach those options using a keyboard. There's then a whole another story of is that information still relayed to stuff like screen readers and stuff. That's a whole nother question, but yeah, first would be like how well does it work with a keyboard? That's definitely step number one.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a few questions coming in. So we've got a first question from Joe. So Joe says, great talk, thanks so much. Lots to think about. Do you recommend any kind of specific form tracking software to help understand how a form is being used by users?
I would not be able to give you a recommendation on that, unfortunately. No.
Cool. We can, yeah. I'm sure if you get in touch, I'm sure.
Yeah, depends on what you're trying to track. I'm 100% sure. Like, I've got plenty of colleagues that could answer that in super fine detail. But like actually tracking a user from a UX point of view is not in my repertoire, so to say.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Joe, if you want to drop us a line at hello@Nomensa, I'm sure we can answer that.
Yeah, most definitely.
So next question we've got here asks if you have any tips for building dynamic forms where, for example, selecting a particular option changes the fields that come after that.
Yeah, that's a very, very tricky interaction, especially from like an assistive technology or a screen reader point of view, because they would need to be aware of basically if content is if selecting an answer would expand new content. I've seen implementations where it's using Aria, expanded to indicate on an answer that that a new question would be revealed. It's definitely a tricky interaction, and I would probably urge you to rather than create a complex interaction, go back to the drawing board and see if you can simplify the form.
Brilliant, thanks, Ronny. So we've got time for maybe one more question. So we have a question here asking if there are any particular accessibility pitfalls to consider for multi-page forms and wizards.
Yeah, so multi-page forms are things we come across quite often. Is they tend to be built as single-page web apps, and then things like page titles aren't updated, which means that a user is less aware of where they are in the process. Another common issue might be that if you're dynamically changing the content of the page, you need to be aware that you move focus to the correct next step. So one thing we also quite often see in these circumstances is focus basically remaining on the next button, so to speak, and not moving to the newly presented input fields. Giving visual indications on where someone is in the process. We see that a lot, but then it's not, that same information is not relayed to screen reader users. So you can have like a visual indication of this form consists of 4 different steps, and you're currently at step 3. And then mostly screen readers will either get announced images or random other stuff, but rarely do they hear a list of steps and the notification that they are currently on step 3. So yeah, that's I think 3 of the more commonly found things on step forms.
Thank you. Awesome. So that is just about all we've got time for. Ronny, thanks again. That's brilliant talk. And yeah, thanks to everyone that tuned in. We are back at 1 p.m. UK time with Max Fumagalli and Marco Fabri from the Depop team, who will be sharing Depop's accessibility journey. So yeah, we will see you back hopefully in a couple of hours at 1 p.m. Yeah, hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you all.